When Julia accepted the job, she had no idea she would be dragged into the heart of a mystery that had lasted for years. A lost diary, a mansion full of secrets, and a family on the brink of collapse. Will her courage be enough to uncover the truth and overcome the challenges ahead? The sound of heart monitors echoed through the halls of New York City Hospital as Julia Anderson adjusted the equipment for her newest patient. Her nimble fingers moved with precision, the result of years of experience as a nurse. Her brown hair, tied in a messy bun after a 12-hour shift, betrayed the exhaustion she tried hard to ignore. "How are you feeling today, Mr. Thompson?" she asked, offering a gentle smile to the elderly man in the bed. "Better, thanks to you, dear," he replied, returning the smile with kind eyes. This was how Julia spent her days at the hospital, with tireless dedication and a unique ability to make each patient feel special. At 28, she had already earned the respect of colleagues and patients alike, even while working in one of the busiest hospitals in the city. That autumn morning, as she organized her notes at the nursing station, Julia couldn't have imagined that her life was about to change completely. The alarm on her tablet sounded, signaling the arrival of a new patient to the hospital's special wing, known for its experimental treatments. "Julia, I need you in room 342, called Dr. Matthews, her supervisor, with an unusual urgency in his voice. "We have an important case coming in." She nodded, grabbing her equipment and quickly following him down the hall. As she entered the OIS room, she was met with a scene that caught her off guard. A young man around 25 years old was being settled into the bed, while a tall man in an impeccable suit stood by the window. The man in the suit turned as he heard her footsteps, and Julia felt an involuntary shiver run down her spine. His deep blue eyes conveyed a coldness that contrasted with the elegance of his features. For a moment, she felt as though he was analyzing her like a complex equation to be solved. "This is Julia Anderson, our head nurse in the special wing," Dr. Matthews introduced. "Julia, this is Mr. Lancaster and his brother Jonathan, who will be our new patient." Daniel Lancaster. The name echoed in her mind like a distant bell. Even though she wasn't an avid reader of business magazines, it was impossible not to recognize the man who frequently appeared in headlines as one of the most successful and mysterious entrepreneurs in the country. "Miss Anderson," Daniel greeted with a brief nod, his voice deep and controlled. "I expect my brother to receive the best possible care." There was something in his tone that sounded more like an order than a request, but Julia maintained her professional demeanor. "You can be sure I'll do my best for Mr. Jonathan," she replied, turning to the patient with a warm smile. Jonathan Lancaster was different from his brother in every possible way. His green eyes radiated genuine kindness, and his smile, though tired, was warm. "Please just call me Jonathan," he requested, adjusting himself on the pillows. In the hours that followed, Julia established Jonathan's care routine, patiently explaining each procedure. Daniel remained in the room the entire time, watching every move with calculated attention, occasionally making notes on his phone. "Your brother will need rest now," Julia informed after completing the initial procedures. "I suggest you get some rest as well, Mr. Lancaster. We have a small waiting room at the end of the hall." Daniel hesitated, looking at Jonathan with an eye expression that for the first time revealed something beyond his mask of indifference. Was it worry? Guilt? Julia couldn't decipher it. "Go, Dan," Jonathan encouraged with a weak smile. "I'm in good hands." Reluctantly, Daniel left the room, not without casting one last penetrating glance at Julia. She felt the weight of that gaze long after he had gone. In the days that followed, Julia developed a routine with the Lancaster siblings. Jonathan was a cooperative patient, always eager to talk about a wide range of topics, from literature to astronomy. Daniel, on the other hand, was a constant and silent presence, appearing at irregular hours, always impeccably dressed, always observing. It was during one of these visits that Julia noticed something unusual. While checking Jonathan's vitals, she saw Daniel looking at an old photo in his wallet. In the image, partially visible, a woman smiled while hugging 3 children. "Our mother," Jonathan explained, noticing Julia's interest. "She loved taking pictures." The use of the past tense didn't go unnoticed, nor did the way Daniel abruptly closed the wallet, tucking it into his jacket pocket with a sharp motion. "Some matters should remain within the family, Jonathan," Daniel warned, his voice carrying a tone of authority that made Julia shrink inwardly. That small, seemingly insignificant moment planted the first seed of curiosity in Julia about the mysteries surrounding the Lancaster family. There was something more in the dynamic between the siblings, something that went beyond the usual concern for an ailing relative. At night, while organizing her reports, Julia found herself thinking about the contrast between the Lancaster brothers. Jonathan, with his open and gentle nature, seemed to belong to a different universe than Daniel, with his aura of power and control. Yet there were moments, brief instants, when she caught something different in the businessman's eyes, a carefully hidden vulnerability, an old pain he struggled to keep under control. What Julia didn't know, as she ended her shift that night, was that this was only the beginning of a story that would change her life forever. The Lancasters had entered her life like a silent hurricane, and the consequences of that encounter would be far deeper than she could imagine. As she stored her belongings in the small locker in the staff room, Julia couldn't predict that soon she would be swept into a world of luxury, secrets, and a deal that would challenge everything she believed about love and sacrifice. Fate had woven its threads with surgical precision, and now there was no turning back. On her way home to her modest apartment in Brooklyn, Julia watched the city lights through the subway window, thinking about how simple and predictable her life had been until then. Little did she know that somewhere in the city, in a grand mansion, Daniel Lancaster was also awake, contemplating a decision that would change the course of their lives forever. The rain fell mercilessly over New York that night, turning the streets of Brooklyn into makeshift rivers. Julia watched the droplets slide down the window of her small apartment as a cup of tea cooled between her hands. 2 weeks had passed since Jonathan Lancaster had been transferred to a specialized clinic in Switzerland, leaving a strange void in her hospital routine. The insistent sound of the doorbell pulled her from her thoughts. Frowning, she checked the clock. 10:47 p.m. Who could it be at this hour? Her neighbors usually respected the nighttime silence, and she wasn't expecting visitors. When she opened the door, Julia felt her heart skip a beat. There, drenched by the rain, yet maintaining an impeccable posture, stood Daniel Lancaster. "Miss Anderson," he greeted, as if it were perfectly normal to show up at a nurse's door in the middle of the night. "May I come in?" Dazed, Julia stepped aside, allowing him entry. Daniel crossed the small living room, his Italian shoes leaving wet marks on the modest floor. His eyes scanned the room, cataloging every detail. The books stacked in the corner, the family photos on the wall, the worn but well-kept sofa. How did you find my address?" Julia asked, recovering from the initial shock. "I have my resources," he replied simply, turning to face her. "But I'm not here to discuss that. I have a proposal for you." Julia felt a shiver run down her spine. There was something in the intensity of Daniel's gaze that made her uncomfortable, as if he could see through her defenses. "What kind of proposal?" "I want you to marry me." The words hung in the air like a cloud of smoke, heavy and unreal. Julia waited for the smile that would indicate a joke, but Daniel's expression remained serious. "Excuse me," she managed to stammer after a few seconds of stunned silence. "It's a simple proposal, Miss Anderson. A business arrangement, if you prefer to think of it that way. You marry me, live as my wife for a year, and in return, you receive complete financial security for yourself and your family." Julia sank onto the couch, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. "This is insane," she murmured. "On the contrary," Daniel replied, his voice maintaining that controlled tone that seemed to be part of his nature. "It's a very rational proposal. I know you have significant student loan debt. Your mother still works 2 jobs to help your younger brother through college, doesn't she?" "How do you—" Julia began, but he interrupted her with a gesture. "I also know that you send part of your salary every month to help them. A noble gesture, but one that keeps you living on the edge of your means." He paused, studying her. Reaction. "I can change that. All debts paid off, your family financially protected, a secure future," All I ask for is 1 year. Julia stood up abruptly, walking to the window. Her mind was spinning with the implications of this absurd proposal. Why me? Why now? Daniel adjusted the sleeve of his wet jacket, a gesture that seemed more like a nervous reflex than a necessity. You showed genuine compassion in caring for Jonathan. You weren't interested in our name or fortune. That's rare in my world. And Jonathan, does he know about this? A shadow passed over Daniel's face. My brother is focused on his treatment now. He doesn't need to worry about other matters. Something in the way he said it triggered a warning in Julia's mind. There was more to this story, much more than Daniel was revealing. How long do I have to think? 1 week, he replied, heading towards the door. I'll return next Sunday for your answer. He paused with his hand on the doorknob, turning partially. Oh, and Miss Anderson, absolute discretion about this conversation is essential. After he left, Julia stayed awake until dawn, her tea long, forgotten on the coffee table. Daniel's words echoed in her mind, mingling with the memories of the days she had spent caring for Jonathan. The following days passed in a blur. At work, Julia found herself distracted, mentally replaying every detail of that surreal night. During her breaks, she obsessively researched the Lancasters, uncovering fragments of their history in online newspapers and magazines. The family had deep roots in New York, with a fortune built over generations. The brothers' mother, Elizabeth Lancaster, had been a prominent figure in society until her sudden disappearance from public life about 15 years ago. Their father, Richard Lancaster, had ruled the family empire with an iron fist until his retirement 2 years ago, when Daniel took control. But it was the subtext that intrigued Julia the most. The notable absences from social events, the rumors of internal conflicts, the speculations about Richard Lancaster's true state of health. Each new discovery only heightened her curiosity about what was really going on in that family. On Thursday, as she organized her monthly expenses, the reality of her financial situation hit her hard. The rent had gone up, her student loan payments kept piling up, and her mother had called earlier to inform her that her father's health insurance would be cancelled due to late payments. Sitting at her small dining table, Julia spread the bills out in front of her like an unsolvable puzzle. Daniel's proposal, as absurd as it seemed, offered a solution to all these problems. But what would the real cost be? On Saturday night, the eve of the deadline, Julia decided to visit her family in Queens. The small townhouse where she had grown up remained the same, with the garden meticulously cared for by her mother and the old hammock on the porch where she used to read during the summers of her childhood. You seem different, her mother commented during dinner, serving a second helping of lasagna. Did something happen at the hospital? Julia forced a smile, feeling the weight of the secret in her chest. Just tired, Mum. The shifts have been tough. She watched her parents exchange worried glances, noticing the new wrinkles on their faces, her father's increasingly graying hair, the way her mother masked the exhaustion of working 2 jobs. They had sacrificed so much for her and her brother, never complaining, always putting their children's needs first. When she said goodbye late that night, her decision was made. Sunday dawned with a blinding clarity, as if the universe wanted to illuminate every doubt and fear in her mind. At exactly 8 p.m., the doorbell rang again. Daniel was even more imposing than during his first visit, wearing a dark suit that seemed tailor-made to intimidate. His eyes met hers, questioning. I accept, Julia said before she could change her mind, but I have some conditions. A shadow of a smile passed over Daniel's lips, so quickly she might have imagined it. I'm listening. First, I want to know your true intentions with this. It's our agreement, not now, but you'll have to tell me eventually. She paused, gathering courage. Second, I keep my job at the hospital. And third, when all of this is over, my family remains protected no matter what happens between us. Daniel studied her for a long moment, as if evaluating not just her words, but her entire being. I accept your conditions, he finally replied. Except the part about my intentions. There are things it's better you don't know, at least for now. Julia nodded, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. And now? Now, he said, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket, we start building our story. The ring was stunning in its simplicity, a single sapphire surrounded by small diamonds. When Daniel slid it onto her finger, Julia felt the weight not just of the jewel but of all the lies they would have to tell, all the secrets they would have to keep. "Welcome to the Lancaster family, Miss Anderson," Daniel said, his voice carrying a note of something that could have been regret or resignation. "I hope you're prepared for what's to come." Looking at the ring on her finger, Julia wondered if she would ever truly be ready for the world of the Lancasters, with its dark secrets and buried truths. But now it was too late to turn back. The deal was sealed, and her life as she knew it had come to an end. What she didn't know was that this night marked only the beginning of a journey that would test not just her courage, but also her ability to distinguish between truth and lies, between appearances and reality. In the world of the Lancasters, nothing was as it seemed, and every answer found would only lead to more questions. The Lancaster mansion stood imposingly against the Manhattan skyline, a three-story Victorian structure that seemed to have been transported directly from a Gothic novel. Julia observed the facade through the limousine window, feeling smaller and smaller as they approached. Beside her, Daniel kept his eyes fixed on his tablet, as he had done throughout the ride from her apartment. "Your sister is already waiting for us," he remarked casually, finally putting the device away. "Vivian likes to personally oversee changes in the house." Something in his tone made Julia straighten in her seat. In the 3 days since she had accepted the proposal, she had obsessively researched Vivian Lancaster. Daniel's older sister was known both for her classic beauty and sharp tongue, a constant figure in the society columns, unlike her brother, who avoided the spotlight whenever possible. The car stopped in front of a marble staircase. Before the driver could open the door, a tall, elegant woman descended the steps. Vivian Lancaster was even more impressive in person. Perfectly styled black hair, flawless makeup, and a dress that probably cost more than 6 months of Julia's salary. "Finally!" Vivian exclaimed, flashing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I've been eager to meet the woman who won over our Danny so quickly." Daniel tensed almost imperceptibly at the nickname. "Vivian, this is Julia Anderson. Julia, my sister Vivian." "It's a pleasure to meet you," Julia offered politely, extending her hand. Vivian observed the gesture for a moment before accepting it, her handshake cold and calculated. "The pleasure is mine, darling. Come, I'll show you your new home." The interior of the mansion was a study in luxury and tradition. Oil paintings of Lancaster ancestors adorned the walls, their stern gazes following visitors through the halls. Venetian crystals captured the light streaming through the tall windows, creating dancing patterns on the marble floor. "The master bedroom has been completely redecorated," Vivian informed them as they ascended the main staircase. "I hope you like blue, darling. It will perfectly match your eyes." "Actually," Daniel interrupted, "Julia will be staying in the East Wing room." Vivian stopped abruptly, turning to face her brother. "Mother's room? But, Danny, it's not up for discussion, Vivian." The air between the siblings grew tense. Julia watched the exchange of glances, sensing the undercurrents of unspoken meanings. "As you wish," Vivian finally conceded, her smile returning like a well-rehearsed mask. "This way, darling." The east wing of the mansion had a different atmosphere from the rest of the house. The lighter curtains allowed generous amounts of natural light, and there was something cozier about the space, as if it held happier memories. The room that would be Julia's was spacious and elegant, decorated in soft shades of green and gold. An antique dressing table occupied one corner, its mirror framed by delicate carvings. On the opposite wall, a French door led to a small private balcony. "Elizabeth had impeccable taste," Vivian remarked, running her fingers over the polished surface of the dressing table. "Everything in this room was personally chosen by her." "Elizabeth?" Julia asked, though she already knew the answer. "Our mother," Daniel replied curtly. "She used to spend a lot of time here." Vivian let out a short, almost bitter laugh. "Oh, yes, especially in her later years. This room was her sanctuary." "Vivian," Daniel warned, his voice carrying a clear admonition. "What?" Can we no longer talk about Mother? Vivian stepped closer to her brother, her eyes glinting dangerously. Or are you afraid your fiancé might discover all our little family secrets? Enough, Daniel ordered. Julia needs to settle in. I'm sure you have other commitments. For a moment, Julia thought Vivian might protest, but she merely adjusted her pearl necklace with a practiced motion. Of course, don't forget about tonight's dinner, darling, she added, addressing Julia. The chef is preparing something special to celebrate your engagement. After Vivian left, a heavy silence fell over the room. Daniel remained still, gazing out the French door with a distant expression. Your sister doesn't approve of our arrangement, Julia observed. Vivian doesn't approve of many things, he replied, turning to face her. Your luggage will arrive shortly. Feel free to make any changes you'd like to the room. Why this room? She asked before he could leave. Why not the main bedroom? Daniel stopped at the door, his hand resting on the frame. Because here, you'll be safe, he replied cryptically, leaving her with more questions than answers. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. A team of staff came and went, bringing in her luggage and organizing her few belongings in the massive closet. A middle-aged woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Collins, the housekeeper, appeared to inform her about meal times and the routines of the house. Dinner is served promptly at 8 p.m., Mrs. Collins explained. Mr. Lancaster values punctuality. Alone again, Julia began to explore her new space. The closet, larger than her old bedroom in Brooklyn, was already partially filled with clothes she certainly hadn't brought. All in her size, all from brands she only knew from magazines. On the dresser, she found a small music box. When she opened it, a soft melody filled the room as a porcelain ballerina spun gracefully. At the bottom of the box, an old photograph showed a young, beautiful woman holding a baby, her radiant smile still contagious after so many years. That's Mom with Vivian, Julia, startled at the voice. A young woman who couldn't have been more than her early 20s stood in the doorway. Her red hair and green eyes were different from the other Lancasters, but there was something in her posture that betrayed her family ties. Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you, the young woman smiled, stepping into the room. I'm Sophie, the inconvenient cousin no one mentions at parties. There was something refreshing about Sophie's frankness, a welcome contrast to the stifling formality Julia had encountered so far. It's nice to meet you, Sophie. I'm Julia Anderson, the nurse who stole Cousin Daniel's heart, Sophie finished with a mischievous grin. News travels fast in this family, especially when Vivian's involved. Julia carefully placed the music box back on the dresser. Did you know Elizabeth well? Not as well as I would have liked, Sophie replied, sitting on the edge of the bed. She was different from the rest of the family, kinder, more present. This room was her sanctuary. She'd spend hours here, reading or just watching the garden. What happened to her? Julia asked, curiosity overcoming her caution. Sophie's smile faltered. That's the question we'd all like answered, she said quietly. One day she was no longer here. Uncle Richard said she had left to seek treatment at a clinic in Europe, but she paused, biting her lip. Perhaps I've already said too much. A soft knock on the door interrupted the conversation. Mrs. Collins appeared, her face expressing disapproval upon seeing Sophie. Miss Sophie, your aunt is looking for you, she informed stiffly. And Miss Anderson, it's time to prepare for dinner. Sophie stood up with a theatrical sigh. Duty calls, but don't worry, we'll have plenty of time to talk. After all, you're part of the family now. After Sophie left, Julia remained seated on the edge of the bed, absorbing everything that had happened. In less than a week, her life had completely transformed. Now she was about to dine with one of the most powerful families in New York, in a room that had belonged to a missing woman, surrounded by secrets and unresolved tensions. Looking at herself in the dressing table mirror, Julia adjusted the engagement ring on her finger. The sapphire sparkled in the late afternoon light, reminding her of Daniel's piercing gaze. What was he hiding? Why this specific room? And more importantly, what role would she truly play in this elaborate family theater? The answers, she suspected, were buried within the walls of that mansion, in the exchanged glances between the siblings, in the unspoken words during conversations. and somehow she knew that uncovering those answers would only be the beginning of a journey far more complex than she could have ever imagined. The Lancaster mansion clock struck 8 as Julia descended the stairs for dinner. She had chosen one of the new dresses found in her closet, a simple yet elegant navy blue design. Her brown hair was loose, falling in soft waves over her shoulders, and the only adornment she wore aside from the engagement ring was a delicate pearl necklace that had belonged to her grandmother. The dining room was a spectacle in itself. The high ceiling housed an impressive crystal chandelier, and the solid mahogany table, which could easily seat 20, was set for 6. The silverware gleamed under the soft light, and elaborate arrangements of white flowers adorned the center of the table. Daniel was already there, speaking in a low voice with an elderly man Julia didn't recognize. Upon seeing her, he interrupted the conversation and walked toward her. "You look beautiful," he murmured, offering his arm. The compliment, though formal, carried a tone of sincerity that caught her off guard. "Julia, darling." Sophie's cheerful voice rang out from across the room. She wore an emerald green dress that accentuated her auburn hair. "Come, I want to introduce you to Uncle Richard." Julia's heart raced. Richard Lancaster, the family patriarch, was an almost mythical figure in the business world. In the past 2 years since his mysterious withdrawal from the presidency of Lancaster Enterprises, few people had actually seen him. The man who turned to face her was not exactly what she had expected. Though he still maintained a dignified posture, Richard Lancaster seemed smaller than in the photographs she had seen, more fragile. His eyes, however, had the same piercing intensity she recognized in Daniel. "So this is the young woman who has won over my son," Richard said, his voice surprisingly strong. "Come closer, my dear. Let me see you better." Julia felt Daniel tense beside her, but she took a step forward. Richard studied her for a long moment, his blue eyes, identical to Daniel's, seeming to search for something in her face. "Interesting," he murmured, more to himself than to the others. "Very interesting." "Dinner is served," Mrs. Collins announced from the doorway, breaking the moment. Vivian, who had quietly entered the room at some point, took her place at the table. "Dad, let the poor girl breathe," she commented with false sweetness. "We'll have plenty of time to get to know her better." The seats at the table seemed to have been determined generations ago. Richard at the head, Daniel to his right, and Vivian to his left. Sophie sat next to Vivian, leaving Julia the seat beside Daniel. The 6th place, at the other end of the table, remained empty. "Elizabeth's seat," Sophie whispered, noticing Julia's questioning look. "No one ever sits there." The first course was served in a heavy, tense silence. It was Richard who finally broke it. "So, Miss Anderson, or May, I call you Julia. Daniel tells me you're a nurse." "Yes, sir." "At the city hospital." "A noble profession," Richard remarked, sipping his wine. "Elizabeth always admired healthcare workers. She said they were society's true guardian angels." "Dad?" Vivian interjected, her voice tense. "Perhaps it's not appropriate." "What's not appropriate, Vivian?" Richard cut her off. "Is your constant attempt to erase your mother from our lives." The silence that followed was deafening. Julia could feel the tension radiating from Daniel, who kept his eyes fixed on his plate. "How is Jonathan?" Sophie asked, in an obvious attempt to change the subject. "I heard the treatment in Switzerland is progressing well." "It is," Daniel replied curtly. "The doctors are optimistic." "Ah, yes, the eternal medical optimism," Vivian commented, her smile sharp as a blade. "Just like they were optimistic about Mom, weren't they?" "Enough!" Daniel slammed the table, making the silverware clatter. "We're not discussing this now." "And when will we discuss it, Danny? When Jonathan disappears like she did, or when someone else in the family needs to be hospitalized for treatment?" "Vivian!" Richard's voice thundered. "You are dismissed." For a moment it seemed Vivian might protest, but then she rose with studied grace. "Of course, Father. After all, we must keep up appearances, mustn't we? Especially now that we have a new actress in our little family theater." After she left, dinner continued in an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the clinking of cutlery and occasional remarks about the weather or the family business. Later, when coffee was served in the library, Richard asked for a moment alone with Julia. Daniel clearly didn't like the idea, but withdrew with Sophie, leaving them alone among the shelves of old books. "You know, my dear," Richard began, settling into his favorite armchair, "when you reach my age, you start to develop a certain instinct for people. And you, Julia Anderson, are not what you seem." Julia felt her heart race but maintained her composure. "I don't understand what you mean, sir." "Oh, you do," he smiled, a smile that reminded her very much of Daniel's. "Just as you understand that my son is also not exactly what he seems. The question is, which of you is hiding the more dangerous secret? Mr. Lancaster." "Richard, please," he gently interrupted. "We're family now, aren't we? Or at least that's what we're supposed to pretend to be." Julia felt her blood run cold. "You know about the arrangement?" "Of course I know. I know my son, Julia. Daniel may be many things, but a man in love he most certainly is not. At least," he paused meaningfully, "not yet." "Why are you telling me this?" Richard leaned forward, his eyes suddenly serious. "Because you remind me of Elizabeth, the same compassion, the same inner strength, and because, like her, you've walked into this family with no idea of what's really going on here." "And what is going on here?" "Ah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?" He chuckled softly. "But I'm not the one to answer it. I can only give you one piece of advice. Keep your eyes open and your heart guarded. In this house, even the walls have secrets." The library door opened and Daniel entered with a concerned expression. "Is everything all right here?" "Perfectly fine," Richard replied, leaning back in his armchair. "Your fiancée is a fascinating young woman, son. She reminds me very much of your mother." Daniel visibly tensed. "Julia, can we go? It's getting late." On the way back to their quarters, Julia tried to process everything that had happened during dinner. Richard's words echoed in her mind, mingling with Vivian's insinuations and Daniel's eloquent silences. "What did my father talk to you about?" Daniel asked when they reached her room door. "Nothing specific," she replied, studying his reaction. "Just family stories." Daniel watched her for a moment, as if trying to determine if she was telling the truth. "Be careful with the stories in this house, Julia. Not all of them have a happy ending." Before she could respond, he leaned in and kissed her forehead, a surprisingly gentle gesture that caught her off guard. "Good night," he murmured, turning to leave. "Daniel," she called, making him stop. "Why did your father say I remind him of your mother?" He remained with his back to her, his silhouette outlined against the hallway light. "Because you, like her, have the gift of seeing beyond appearances. And in this family," he added softly, "that can be both a blessing and a curse." Alone in her room, Julia walked to the balcony, letting the night breeze refresh her thoughts. Down below in the garden, a solitary figure walked among the rose bushes. Vivian, her black dress standing out against the greenery like a restless shadow. The Lancaster mansion kept its secrets well, but Julia was beginning to realize that each family member carried their own version of the truth. The question was, which one would explain Elizabeth's disappearance? And more importantly, which one would justify her own role in this elaborate family drama? The mansion's clock chimed 11 times, its sound echoing through the empty halls, like a solemn reminder that time was passing. And with each passing hour, Julia found herself more deeply entangled in a web of mysteries that seemed to have no end. The routine at New York City Hospital felt strangely normal to Julia that morning, as if the past few days had been nothing more than an elaborate dream. The familiar smell of disinfectant, the rhythmic sound of heart monitors, the whispered conversations in the hallways, all of it served as an anchor of reality amidst the whirlwind her life had become. "Anderson!" Dr. Matthews's voice snapped her out of her thoughts. "I need you in the meeting room." Julia followed him, unconsciously, adjusting the engagement ring that now weighed heavily on her finger. In the past few days, since the news of her engagement to Daniel Lancaster had leaked to the press, she had noticed curious glances and interrupted conversations as she passed by. The meeting room was empty, except for a stack of medical records on the table. Dr. Matthews closed the door behind them, his face taking on a serious expression that Julia rarely saw. "We need to talk about Jonathan Lancaster," he said without preamble. Julia's heart raced. What about him? I received an interesting call this morning. The clinic in Switzerland, well, they never received a patient by that name. Julia felt the ground sway beneath her feet. What do you mean? Daniel Lancaster said a lot of things, Dr. Matthews gently interrupted her. But as your supervisor, and I dare say, as someone who cares about your well-being, I need to show you something. He opened one of the medical records, revealing documents Julia had never seen before. This is Jonathan's complete history, not just from this hospitalization, but from the last 15 years. Julia examined the papers, her stomach tightening. With each new discovery, the dates, the diagnoses, the treatments, none of it matched the story Daniel had told her. But this means that Jonathan Lancaster never left New York, Dr. Matthews finished. He's been admitted to a private clinic on the outskirts of the city. In fact, the same clinic where Elizabeth Lancaster spent her final months before disappearing. The revelation hit Julia like a punch. Her hands trembled as she flipped through more documents, finding records that connected mother and son in ways she could never have imagined. Why are you showing me this now? Dr. Matthews sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. Because you're about to marry a man who has been manipulating medical information for years, and because, he hesitated, Elizabeth Lancaster was my patient too. Julia's eyes shot up. What? She came to me weeks before her disappearance. She was worried not just about Jonathan, but about the entire family. She said she had discovered something that could destroy the Lancasters. What did she discover? I never found out. In our last conversation, she mentioned documents hidden in her room, but before she could tell me more, she disappeared, Julia whispered. Exactly. And now, 15 years later, you're sleeping in the same room, engaged to the same man who took control of everything after her disappearance. Julia felt a chill run down her spine. Elizabeth's room, her sanctuary, could it still hold secrets after all this time? Dr. Matthews, why didn't you ever report this? He laughed humorlessly. Report the Lancasters? With what evidence? Besides, he lowered his voice, Elizabeth made me promise to protect Jonathan above all else. That's why I allowed him to be treated here, away from the family's eyes. But did Daniel know? Daniel knows everything, Julia. He always has. The question is, why did he choose you? Why now? Before she could respond, her phone vibrated. A message from Daniel asking if she could meet him for lunch. The irony of the moment wasn't lost on her. Be careful, Julia, Dr. Matthews warned as she stood up. The Lancasters are masters at turning truths into lies and lies into truths. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Julia cancelled lunch with Daniel, citing a hospital emergency. She needed time to think, to process everything she had discovered. During her break, she took refuge in the hospital chapel, a quiet place where she often meditated during difficult times. It was there that Sophie found her. I knew I'd find you here, the redhead said, sitting beside her. Daniel is worried. You never cancel on him. How did you know where to find me? Sophie smiled sadly. Elizabeth used to come here too. She said it was the only place she could think clearly. Sophie, Julia began, choosing her words carefully. You know where Jonathan really is, don't you? The smile faded from the young woman's face. So you found out. Why all this lie about Switzerland? Because, Sophie whispered, the truth about Jonathan is directly tied to Aunt Elizabeth's disappearance. And Daniel, well, he would do anything to protect that secret. Including marrying a stranger? Especially that. Sophie took Julia's hand, her green eyes intense. You weren't chosen by chance, Julia. Daniel has been watching you for months, long before Jonathan was admitted here. The revelation made Julia stand up abruptly. What? Think about it, Sophie continued. Why a specific nurse from a public hospital? Why Elizabeth's room? Why now? Sophie, if you know something. I only know that Aunt Elizabeth left clues, Sophie interrupted, also standing up. Clues that only someone with your heart could find. Maybe that's why Daniel chose you. Or maybe, she added with an enigmatic smile, that's why he's starting to truly fall for you. Before Julia could process that last piece of information, her pager went off, an emergency in the wing where she used to work. "I have to go," she said, already heading for the door. "Julia," Sophie called, stopping her, "there's something you need to know about the room." "The mirror on the dresser. It's not just a mirror." With those cryptic words echoing in her mind, Julia rushed to attend to the emergency. But for the rest of her shift, she couldn't stop thinking about Elizabeth's room, the mysterious mirror, and the layers of secrets that seemed to multiply with each new discovery. That evening, when she finally returned to the mansion, she found Daniel waiting for her in the foyer. His usually composed face showed signs of genuine concern. You okay?" he asked, stepping toward her. "I was worried when you cancelled lunch." Julia studied him, trying to reconcile the man in front of her with the day's revelations. How much of what she knew about him was true? How much was just another carefully constructed layer of illusion? "Just a tough day at the hospital," she replied, watching his reaction. "Sometimes patients make us question everything we thought we knew." Daniel seemed to catch something in her tone because his eyes narrowed slightly. "I see, maybe we should talk about it." "Maybe," she agreed, starting up the stairs. "But not today. Today I just need to rest." "Julia," he called as she reached the middle of the staircase, "whatever you may have discovered today, know that everything I've done, everything I'm doing is to protect my family." She turned to face him. "And what about me, Daniel? Am I part of that family now, or just another piece in your game of protection?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meanings. For a moment, Julia thought she saw something break in Daniel's mask of control, a flicker of real emotion crossing his features. "You," he finally replied, "are the only person who can make this family real again." With those enigmatic words echoing in her ears, Julia climbed the rest of the stairs toward Elizabeth's room. Her room now. The mirror on the dresser seemed to call to her, holding secrets she wasn't yet ready to uncover. That night, as the Lancaster mansion slept under the weight of its own lies, Julia remained awake, watching the moonlight dance across the mysterious mirror. Somewhere, between the reflections of the past and the shadows of the present, the answers awaited her. The question was, would she be ready to face the truth when she found it? Dawn was approaching when Julia finally gathered the courage to examine the mirror. Sophie's words echoed in her mind. It's not just a mirror. Under the soft glow of the lamp, she carefully studied the antique piece, her fingers tracing the ornate frame in search of some clue. The mirror itself was a work of art, with delicate carvings that told stories through symbols, intertwined roses, birds in flight, and what appeared to be a sequence of constellations. At the base, almost imperceptible, was an inscription in Latin, Veritas in reflexione, the truth in the reflection. "What are you trying to show me?" Julia murmured, leaning closer to the mirror. It was then that she noticed something strange. One of the rose carvings seemed slightly different from the others, as if it had been frequently manipulated. With her heart racing, she pressed the carving. A soft click echoed in the silence of the room, and a small secret drawer opened on the side of the dresser. Inside, there was a navy blue journal and an old key. Julia picked up the journal with trembling hands. On the first page, Elizabeth Lancaster's elegant handwriting danced under the light. "To whoever finds this journal, may you have the courage I lack to reveal the truth. The key opens the chest in the attic, EL. The pages that followed were a deep dive into Elizabeth's mind. Her first entries dated back 15 years, just a few months before her disappearance. Something is wrong with this family. Richard has changed since he took full control of the businesses. The documents I found in the office, if this is true, nothing we built is legitimate. And Jonathan, my sweet Jonathan, has noticed something too. Is that why they want to silence him?" Julia kept reading, each page revealing more layers of the mystery. "Daniel found out I'm investigating. Today he confronted me in the garden. 'Mother,' he said, 'some truths are too dangerous to be revealed. But how can I stay silent?' Jonathan is getting worse every day, and now Vivian has started asking questions too. A noise in the hallway made Julia freeze. Footsteps were approaching her room. Quickly, she tucked the journal and the key into her work bag, closing the secret drawer just in time to see the doorknob turn. It was Vivian. "Still awake, dear?" she asked, stepping into the room uninvited. Her eyes scanned the space like a radar, lingering for a moment on the mirror. "Just organizing a few things," Julia replied, keeping her voice casual. "The shift today was hectic." Vivian murmured, moving closer to the dresser. "You know, I used to watch Mom at this mirror for hours. She always said mirrors hold memories of the moments they witness." There was something in Vivian's tone that made Julia shiver. "You miss her?" "More than you can imagine," Vivian replied, surprising Julia with her sudden sincerity. "But you know what's worse than losing someone? Finding out that person wasn't who you thought they were." "What do you mean?" Vivian turned to face her, her eyes glinting strangely in the dim light. "Mom had her secrets, Julia. Secrets that could have destroyed this family. Daniel did what needed to be done to protect us." "And what exactly did he do, Vivian?" For a moment, something akin to pain crossed the older woman's face. "Ask him. After all, you're getting married, aren't you? There should be trust between husband and wife." She walked to the door, pausing at the threshold. "But a piece of advice: some questions are better left unanswered." After Vivian left, Julia waited another hour before venturing out of the room. The attic, she discovered by studying the mansion's floor plan on her tablet, was on the 3rd floor, accessible by a staircase at the end of the east hallway. The stairs creaked softly under her feet as she climbed. The attic was a spacious area filled with furniture covered in white sheets and old trunks stacked in the shadows. Moonlight streamed through a skylight, creating ghostly patterns on the dusty floor. After a few minutes of searching, Julia found the trunk mentioned in the diary. It was smaller than the others, with bronze details that matched the carvings on the mirror. The key fit perfectly into the lock. Inside the trunk, there was a leather folder filled with documents, old photographs, and, surprisingly, a modern flash drive. But before she could examine its contents, a noise alerted her. Someone else was in the attic. "You shouldn't be here," Daniel's voice came from the shadows, making her jump. "How did you know?" "Security cameras," he replied, stepping closer. "They record every movement in the house, including Vivian's late-night visits to your room." Julia stood up, still holding the folder. "So you know about the mirror, about the diary?" "I know many things, Julia, including that Dr. Matthews finally told you about Jonathan. Why did you lie to me?" Daniel ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of nervousness. "Because the truth about Jonathan is connected to my mother's disappearance, and you..." He hesitated. "You're the first person in 15 years to come close to figuring out what really happened. Is that why you chose me? To keep me close?" Controlled? "At first, yes," he admitted, his honesty surprising her. "But now what, Daniel?" He took another step toward her, his face partially lit by the moonlight. "Now I don't know what to think anymore. You've thrown all my plans into chaos, Julia. You were supposed to be just a pawn on the board, but you've become something more." "What plans?" "The plans to protect my family, to keep the secrets buried, but you..." He touched her face gently. "You have the same look she had, the same desire to uncover the truth, no matter the cost." "And what was the cost for Elizabeth?" Daniel's hand dropped, his face returning to its usual mask of control. "Some secrets are too dangerous to be revealed, Julia. My mother found that out the hard way." "Is that a threat?" "No," he replied, his voice softening. "It's a warning. A warning I should have given her, but I was too young, too arrogant to see the signs." Julia looked at the folder in her hands, then back at Daniel. "What's in these documents?" "The truth about Lancaster Enterprises, about my father, about..." He hesitated. "About what really happened to Jonathan." "And are you going to tell me?" Daniel was silent for a long moment, the moonlight dancing in his blue eyes. "Not today," he finally answered. "But I promise I will. When I'm ready. When I'm sure." "Sure of what?" "That I can trust you completely. That what I feel..." He stopped as if the words were too difficult. "That what's happening between us is real. Before Julia could process the meaning of those words, a noise from downstairs caught both their attention. Footsteps on the stairs, whispered voices. "Go back to your room," Daniel ordered softly. "Leave the folder with me. I promise I'll explain. Everything, but not now." Something in the urgency of his voice made Julia obey. As she hurried down the back stairs, she could hear voices coming from the main hallway, Vivian and someone she didn't recognize. Back in the safety of her room, Julia pulled Elizabeth's diary from her bag. There was still so much to read, so much to uncover. But Daniel's words echoed in her mind, mingling with the day's revelations. What's happening between us is real. Was it? Amid so many lies and half-truths, how could she distinguish what was genuine from what was just another layer of the Lancasters' elaborate facade? And more importantly, was she ready to uncover a truth that had already cost so much to so many? The mirror on the dresser reflected her thoughtful face, silently guarding its own secrets. Somewhere between the pages of Elizabeth's diary and the documents Daniel now possessed lay the key to the entire mystery. The question was, what would be the ultimate price of this truth? The morning brought unexpected news. Richard Lancaster had been admitted during the early hours. Julia received the information from Mrs. Collins as she was preparing to go to the hospital. "Mr. Lancaster specifically asked for you," the housekeeper informed her, her usually impassive face betraying concern. "He's at St. Francis Hospital." Daniel was already there when Julia arrived, his tall figure silhouetted against the window of the private room where Richard rested. Vivian occupied an armchair in the corner, idly flipping through a magazine while Sophie dozed in a chair near the bed. "Julia," Richard smiled weakly upon seeing her. "I'm glad you came." She approached the bed, her nurse instincts automatically assessing the monitors and the patient's overall condition. "How are you feeling?" "Like a man who has carried secrets for far too long," he replied, his meaningful gaze meeting hers. "Daniel, dear, could you give us a moment alone?" Daniel hesitated, casting a worried glance at Julia before nodding. "I'll get some coffee," he said, lightly touching her shoulder as he passed. "Vivian, Sophie," Richard called. "You too, please." After everyone left, a heavy silence fell over the room. Richard adjusted himself in bed, his movements slow and deliberate. "Do you know why I chose this hospital?" he finally asked. Julia shook her head, confused by the seemingly random question. "Elizabeth volunteered here for years," he continued. "In the children's ward, this is where she first met Jonathan." "What?" Richard smiled sadly. "Ah, yes, another Lancaster family secret. Jonathan is not my biological son, Julia. He is Elizabeth's child from a relationship before our marriage." The revelation struck Julia like a bolt of lightning. "But everyone thinks he's your son." "Precisely. Elizabeth was already pregnant when we met. I loved her so much that I didn't care. I legally adopted Jonathan, gave him the Lancaster name, and raised him as our own. Few know the truth. Does Daniel know?" "Daniel found out by accident when he was 16. He stumbled upon the adoption papers in my office. It was difficult for him to accept that his younger brother wasn't really his blood brother." Julia processed the information, the puzzle pieces starting to fall into place. "Is that why Elizabeth was investigating the companies? Because of Jonathan?" Richard closed his eyes for a moment. "Elizabeth did discover something in the companies. Yes, something that could affect Jonathan's inheritance. You see, when I adopted the boy, I included a special clause in my will. A significant portion of the companies would go to him when he turned 25. The age he is now," Julia murmured. "Exactly. Elizabeth found irregularities in the company documents, suspicious transactions dating back to my father's time. She feared that if this information came to light, Jonathan would lose his inheritance." "Rights. And that's why she disappeared." Richard held Julia's hand, his fingers cold and trembling. "Elizabeth planned to expose everything, not just to protect Jonathan, but because she believed it was the right thing to do. The night she disappeared, we had a terrible argument. Daniel was there. He tried to mediate, to convince his mother to wait, to think of another solution. What happened next? She went out to cool off, as she always did when we were upset. But this time, his voice faltered, this time she didn't come back. Julia felt her heart tighten, and the documents she found? They disappeared with her. Or at least that's what we thought, until you found that folder in the attic. Julia startled. How? Daniel told me about it last night, Richard explained. He's different since you came into our lives. More open, more like the boy he was before we lost Elizabeth. Before Julia could respond, a nurse came in to check Richard's vitals. When they were alone again, he continued. Jonathan doesn't know he's not my biological son. Elizabeth wanted to tell him when he turned 25, along with his inheritance rights. Now, he sighed heavily, now I fear the truth might worsen his condition. Is that why Daniel insists on keeping him isolated? Daniel carries a lot of guilt, Julia. He was there on Elizabeth's last night. He was the last person to see her. Whatever happened that night changed my son forever. A soft knock on the door announced Daniel's return. He entered carrying 2 cups of coffee, offering one to Julia. Everything all right here? He asked, his gaze shifting between her and his father. Yes, Richard replied with a tired smile. Just laying some cards on the table. Daniel frowned. Dad. She needs to know, son. If she's going to be part of this family, she needs to understand why we do what we do. Julia watched the exchange of glances between father and son, realizing for the first time the weight of responsibility Daniel carried. It wasn't just the Lancaster business empire on his shoulders, but also the secrets, the lies, the impossible choices he had been forced to make since he was young. I'm going to visit Jonathan today, she announced suddenly. Both men looked at her in surprise. I don't think that's a good idea, Daniel began. I'm not asking for permission, Julia gently interrupted. As his future wife and as his nurse, I have that right. Richard chuckled softly. She has the same fire as Elizabeth, doesn't she? Daniel ran a hand over his face, a gesture of resignation. I'll take you, he offered finally, but we need to set some ground rules. The only rule I need is honesty, Julia replied, looking him straight in the eye. No more half-truths, Daniel. If we're going to make this work, I need to trust you. Something shifted in his expression, an almost imperceptible softening of his always controlled features. All right, he agreed, but there are things you need to know before you see Jonathan. Things about the night my mother disappeared. Then tell me, she challenged. Not here, he glanced meaningfully at his father. Tonight, after dinner, in the winter garden. Richard cleared his throat, softly. Daniel, son, before you go, there's one more thing Julia needs to know. Daniel visibly tensed. Dad, I don't think this is the time. It's about Jonathan's real father, Richard continued, ignoring his son's protest. He's alive, Julia, and he's closer than you think. The door to the room opened again and Vivian entered, accompanied by a man Julia recognized immediately. Dr. Matthews. Ah, how wonderful, Vivian remarked with false cheer. It seems we've arrived just in time for the family revelations. The look Dr. Matthews gave Richard was heavy with decades of untold history. Julia watched, stunned, noticing the subtle similarities between her mentor and Jonathan, the same green eyes, the same shape of the face. I think, Daniel said, his voice tense, we all have a lot to talk about. Richard's heart monitor marked the seconds with rhythmic beeps, while the weight of unspoken truths hung over everyone in the room, like a dense cloud. Julia felt Daniel's hand searching for hers, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that seemed both an apology and a promise. The morning had barely begun, and already the Lancaster world was transforming once again, revealing new layers of secrets and lies that threatened to destroy the fragile bonds holding the family together. And at the center of it all, like a thread connecting past and present, was the mystery of Elizabeth's disappearance, a mystery that Julia was beginning to suspect might cost more than any of them were prepared to pay. The Lancaster mansion's winter garden was an impressive structure of glass and wrought iron, illuminated by the soft glow of the full moon. Exotic plants of all kinds created an almost magical atmosphere, with their lush foliage and rare flowers, perfuming the night air. Julia arrived first, as agreed. After the tumultuous day at the hospital, she had barely had time to process all the revelations. Dr. Matthews, her mentor, the man who had guided her career, was Jonathan's biological father. The irony of fate wasn't lost on her. Somehow, she had always been connected to the Lancasters, even without knowing it. The sound of footsteps on the gravel alerted her to Daniel's arrival. He had traded his formal suit for more casual attire, dark pants and a grey cashmere sweater, a rare sight of a less polished Lancaster. "Sorry I'm late," he said, approaching. "I had to sort out some things with Vivian." "How is she handling all of this?" Daniel laughed humorlessly. "The way Vivian always handles things, planning, manipulating, trying to keep control of the situation." He walked over to a wrought iron bench, gesturing for Julia to sit. For a moment, only the sound of the small fountain and the rustling of leaves filled the silence between them. "Where should I even begin?" Daniel finally asked. "With the night your mother disappeared." He nodded as if he had expected that. "It was a night like this, clear and warm. I had just come back from college for the weekend. I found Mom in the office, going through old company documents." Daniel paused, his eyes fixed on a distant point, as if he could see the scene unfolding again. She was agitated, talking about irregularities she had discovered, about how we needed to clean the family's name before Jonathan took his share of the inheritance. I tried to calm her down, to ask her to wait until we could analyze everything calmly. But she didn't want to wait, Julia deduced. No, she said she had already waited too long, that she had promised Robert, Dr. Matthews, she would protect their son's future. That's when my father walked into the office. Daniel stood up, walking over to one of the glass windows. His reflection blended with the darkness of the garden outside. The argument was terrible. Dad was furious that she had investigated the company records without his knowledge. She accused him of being complicit in the irregularities, of helping my grandfather build an empire on lies. What kind of irregularities? Fraud, mostly. My grandfather had built the Lancaster fortune through elaborate financial manipulation schemes. Millions of dollars diverted, investors harmed, forged documents. Mum discovered everything in the old archives. And your father knew? He claimed he didn't, but Mum... She had proof that he had helped cover it all up when he took over as president. That's why she was so determined to expose the truth before Jonathan got involved in the family business. Julia processed the information slowly. What happened after the argument? Mom went out for her nightly walk, as she always did when she was upset. I followed her to the garden, tried once more to convince her to reconsider. She hugged me, his voice faltered slightly, and said that sometimes we need to destroy everything to build something better. Were those her last words to you? Daniel turned, and Julia was surprised to see unshed tears in his eyes. No, her last words were, "Take care of your siblings, Daniel. They'll need you more than ever." And then? Then she got into her car and left. The security cameras showed her driving toward the coast. The car was found 2 days later, abandoned, near a cliff. There were no signs of her. Julia stood up, moving closer to him. "Do you think she—" "No," Daniel interrupted firmly. "I know my mother. She would never do that. She had a plan, she had documents, evidence. Something happened that night, something I haven't been able to figure out even after 15 years of searching." "Is that why you keep Jonathan isolated? To protect him from the truth about the family?" "Partly," he admitted. "But also because after Mom disappeared, he started having episodes. He said he saw things, heard voices. The doctors diagnosed it as a psychotic break triggered by trauma. Dr. Matthews, Robert, agreed that the best course was to keep him in controlled treatment." "And Vivian, how does she fit into all of this?" A sad smile appeared on Daniel's face. Vivian was Dad's favorite. She always knew how to balance the family's expectations with her own desires. When Mom disappeared, she took on the role of matriarch, trying to keep everyone together in her own way. "Controlling everything and everyone," Julia added. "It's her way of showing she cares," Daniel defended softly. "Vivian may seem cold, but she suffered as much as the rest of us. Only unlike Jonathan, she channeled her pain into determination." Julia took another step toward him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him. "And you, Daniel? How did you channel your pain?" He looked at her, his blue eyes intense in the moonlight. "I became what the family needed me to be. The responsible son, the protective brother, the ruthless executive. I buried my emotions so deep that sometimes I forgot they existed. Until now." "Until you," he whispered, raising his hand to touch her face. "You came into our lives the way Mom would have, questioning, investigating, genuinely caring. And, like her, you have the gift of seeing through the masks we wear. Is that why you chose me? Because I remind you of your mother?" "At first, yes," he admitted. "I needed someone who could understand Jonathan the way she did, someone who wouldn't be intimidated by the family's secrets. But now what?" Daniel leaned in slightly, his forehead almost touching hers. "Now I realize I miscalculated. I planned everything so carefully, the meeting at the hospital, the arranged engagement, even giving you her room. But I didn't plan on falling in love with you." The confession hung between them like a delicate soap bubble, fragile and iridescent in the moonlight. Julia felt her heart race, aware that they were at a pivotal point in their story. "How can I trust this?" she asked softly. "How can I be sure it's not just another part of your plan?" "Because for the first time in 15 years, he replied, his voice hoarse with emotion, "I don't have a plan. You've thrown them all into chaos, Julia. You've made me question every decision, every lie I told to protect my family. You've made me remember the man I was before I lost my mother." Before she could respond, a movement at the entrance of the winter garden caught her attention. Sophie stood there, her face pale in the moonlight. "Daniel," she called, her voice trembling slightly. "It's Jonathan. He's asking for Julia." Daniel quickly stepped back, his mask of control slipping back into place. "What happened?" "He had another episode," Sophie explained, "but this time it's different. He's lucid, more lucid than I've seen him in years, and he says—" She hesitated, glancing nervously at Julia. "He says he knows where Elizabeth is." The air in the winter garden seemed to freeze. Daniel and Julia exchanged a loaded glance before following Sophie outside. The night had begun with promises of revelations, but now it promised much more, the possibility of finally unraveling the mystery that had shaped their lives for the past 15 years. As they hurried to the car, Julia couldn't help but notice how Daniel's hand sought hers, their fingers intertwining in a firm grip. Whatever awaited them, they would face it together, no longer as pieces in an elaborate game, but as partners united by fate and perhaps by something much deeper. The private clinic where Jonathan was staying was located on an isolated property on the outskirts of New York. The Victorian building, with its tall windows and well-kept gardens, looked more like a country mansion than a medical facility. Julia observed the imposing facade through the car window as Daniel spoke in a low voice with the attending physician. Dr. Matthews, Robert, she corrected herself mentally, was already waiting for them at the entrance, his usually serene face marked by concern. "How is he?" Julia asked as they approached. "Different," Robert replied, guiding them through the quiet hallways. "It's as if something has awakened in him. It started earlier tonight. He asked what day it was, wanted to know about Elizabeth, and then began talking about a place called House of Roses." Daniel stopped abruptly. "House of Roses? Are you sure?" Robert nodded. He mentioned it several times. He said it was important that Julia knew, that only she could understand. They arrived at a more secluded wing of the clinic. Through an observation window, Julia could see Jonathan sitting in an armchair, flipping through a book with genuine interest. A surprisingly normal scene for someone who had spent the last few years in a near catatonic state. "He asked for you specifically," Robert said to Julia. "But I must warn you, Jonathan is more lucid, yes, but he's still unpredictable. If he starts to get agitated—" "It won't happen," she gently interrupted. "Trust me." Daniel held her arm as she headed for the door. "Be careful," he murmured. "Jonathan may seem better, but you don't believe he actually knows something about your mother," Julia concluded. A conflict of emotions crossed Daniel's face. I want to believe. But after so many years, so many false leads. Sometimes, she said softly, we need to have faith in the people we love. Entering the room, Julia was immediately struck by the change in Jonathan. His eyes, once clouded by medication, were now clear and alert. He smiled when he saw her, a smile that strongly reminded her of Elizabeth in the old photographs. Julia, he greeted her, closing the book. I knew you'd come. How are you feeling, Jonathan? Lighter, he replied, gesturing for her to sit, as if a fog has lifted. You know, for years I lived in a kind of dream, where reality and imagination blurred, but now, he paused, glancing at the observation window where Daniel and Robert were watching them. Now I can see everything clearly. What exactly can you see? Jonathan leaned forward, lowering his voice. Mum didn't disappear that night, Julia. She hid at the House of Roses. What is the House of Roses? It was our secret, he smiled, lost in memories. An old property near the lake surrounded by rose gardens. Mom bought it in secret years before everything happened. She said it was our refuge in case things went wrong. Julia felt her heart race. And you think she's there? Not now, Jonathan shook his head. But she was. She left something there for me, something important. And now that you're here, I can finally retrieve it. Why me? Jonathan studied her for a moment, his green eyes, so much like Robert's, shining with unexpected wisdom. Because you're like her. You see beyond appearances, beyond the lies we tell ourselves. And most importantly, he lowered his voice even further, because Daniel trusts you, even if he doesn't fully realize it yet. Jonathan, Julia hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Do you know about your father? A sad smile appeared on his face. About Robert? Yes, I've always known. Mom never hid it from me, even though everyone thought otherwise. It was part of our secret, you understand, just like the House of Roses. Why did you never say anything? Because sometimes, he replied with surprising clarity, keeping a secret is the only way to protect those we love. Mom understood that too late, but I've had 15 years to think about it. Julia processed his words slowly. The documents your mother found. They're at the House of Roses, Jonathan finished, along with other truths she uncovered. But it's not just papers, Julia. It's something bigger, something that could change everything. How can I find this place? Jonathan grabbed a piece of paper and a pen from the table beside him, quickly sketching a map. Follow the old lake road after the third curve, there's a dirt path. The gates have roses carved into the iron, you can't miss it. He handed her the map, his fingers trembling slightly. But Julia, he added urgently, you need to go alone. Daniel, he's not ready for certain truths. Not yet. What truths? About the night Mum disappeared, about his role in all of it. Jonathan looked back at the observation window. My brother carries a lot of guilt, Julia. Guilt that isn't entirely his. Before she could ask more questions, Jonathan began to show signs of exhaustion. Robert entered the room, checking his vitals with paternal concern. Rest a bit, he suggested to his son, the word sounding strange yet natural on his lips. In the hallway, Daniel waited anxiously. What did he say? Julia hesitated, Jonathan's words echoing in her mind. He's more lucid than we thought, she replied carefully. He talked about the past, about his mother, and about the House of Roses. Yes, she admitted, studying his reaction. Do you know the place? A shadow crossed Daniel's face. It was one of Mom's favorite places. We used to spend some weekends there when we were kids, before everything changed. Why did you never look there? We searched, he replied, running his hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. It was one of the first places. We checked after she disappeared. It was abandoned, covered in dust. There were no signs that anyone had been there for months. Julia gently touched his arm. Maybe it's time to look again, with fresh eyes. Daniel studied her for a long moment, as if trying to read her thoughts. You believe him, don't you? You believe that after all these years, I believe Jonathan is trying to tell us something important, she replied diplomatically. And I think we owe it to ourselves to at least investigate. He nodded slowly. All right. Early tomorrow we can... No, Julia interrupted softly. I need to do this alone first. Absolutely not, Daniel protested. It's dangerous. You don't know the area. Daniel. She cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. Trust me. Like you trusted me when you chose me. Like you trusted me when you told me the truth in the winter garden. Some journeys we need to take alone. For a moment she thought he might protest again, but then something in his eyes changed, a silent understanding passing between them. Promise me you'll be careful, he asked, his voice hoarse with concern. I promise, she smiled, kissing him gently. And I promise that whatever I find there, you'll be the first to know. As they returned to the mansion, Julia could feel the weight of the map in her pocket like a tangible secret. Jonathan's words echoed in her mind, blending with the revelations of the past weeks into a complex puzzle that was about to be completed. Tomorrow she would visit the House of Roses, and perhaps finally the last pieces of the Lancaster mystery would fall into place. Dawn had barely broken when Julia left the Lancaster mansion. Following the map drawn by Jonathan, she drove for nearly an hour until she found the old lake road. The dirt path, almost hidden by vegetation, led to a wrought iron gate where delicately carved roses danced between the bars. The House of Roses was smaller than the Lancaster mansion, but it had its own charm. Built in the English cottage style, it was partially covered by vines and wild roses that had grown freely over the years. The garden, though neglected, still bore traces of its former beauty. Using the key she had found with Elizabeth's diary, Julia opened the front door. The interior was exactly as Daniel had described, dusty with furniture covered in white sheets, like silent ghosts of an interrupted life. Yet, something caught her attention. On the living room table, a vase held fresh roses. Someone has been here recently, she murmured to herself, touching the still soft petals. Following her instinct, Julia climbed the stairs to the second floor. The hallway led to several rooms, but one in particular stood out. The door was slightly ajar, and a gentle breeze swayed the curtains. It was an office. Unlike the rest of the house, this room showed signs of recent use. On the desk, folders and documents were meticulously organized, and there, sitting in an armchair by the window, was a woman Julia instantly recognized from the photographs, Elizabeth Lancaster. I knew you would come, Elizabeth said softly, a gentle smile on her time-worn face. Jonathan told me you had found the diary. Julia stood frozen, her mind struggling to process the reality before her. You've been alive all this time? It was the only way to protect them, Elizabeth replied, gesturing to the chair in front of her. Please, sit down. We have much to discuss. With trembling legs, Julia obeyed. Up close, she could see the marks that 15 years had left on Elizabeth. Her hair now completely white, deeper lines on her face, but the same sharp eyes she had seen in the old photographs. Why? Was all Julia could manage to ask. Elizabeth sighed, a sound heavy with years of loneliness and regret. Because I discovered something terrible, something that could destroy not only the Lancaster family, but many other powerful families in New York. She stood up, walking over to the desk and picking up an old folder. The documents I found weren't just about financial fraud. They were evidence of a much larger conspiracy. Richard, my husband, wasn't just complicit in his father's wrongdoing. He was the architect of the entire scheme. And Daniel, did he know? Daniel found out the same night I disappeared, Elizabeth explained, her voice trembling slightly. He followed me here, confronted me with the documents he had found on his own. He was devastated, furious, but above all terrified of what that truth would do to our family. Julia felt her heart tighten. Is that why he let you go? That's why we made a deal, Elizabeth corrected. I would disappear, taking the most incriminating evidence with me. In return, he would protect Jonathan and Vivian from the truth, take over the family business and gradually correct the mistakes of the past. But why not come back after everything was resolved? Elizabeth smiled sadly. Because some wounds are too deep to heal. Daniel carried the weight of that decision for 15 years, becoming the man you knew, controlled, distant, dedicated only to protecting what was left of our family. And Jonathan? Why keep him isolated? Jonathan has always been sensitive, always seen beyond appearances. His episodes began when he realized the truth about Richard, even before I discovered the documents. Keeping him at the clinic was the only way to protect him and to keep him close to his real father. Dr. Matthews, Robert, Elizabeth corrected gently, the only man I ever truly loved. He understood my decision, even if he didn't fully agree with it. He took care of our son when I couldn't. Julia processed all this information slowly. And now? Why let me find out all of this? Because you've changed, Daniel, Elizabeth replied simply. For the first time in 15 years, I've seen my son begin to allow himself to feel again. Through you, he's learning that not all love has to be sacrificed in the name of duty. A noise from downstairs made both of them turn. Footsteps. Hurriedly climbed the stairs. He followed me, Julia realized. Elizabeth didn't seem surprised. Of course he did. Daniel would never let you face this alone, even while respecting your request for space. The office door swung open, revealing Daniel. He stopped abruptly upon seeing his mother, all color draining from his face. "Mom?" His voice sounded like that of a lost boy. Elizabeth stood, opening her arms. "My son." What followed was one of the most powerful moments Julia had ever witnessed. Daniel Lancaster, the man who had built his life on control and discipline, crumbled into his mother's arms like a child. Deep sobs shook his shoulders as Elizabeth held him, murmuring words of comfort. "Forgive me," he whispered repeatedly. "Forgive me for not finding another way." "There's nothing to forgive," Elizabeth replied, cradling her son's face in her hands. "You did what needed to be done to protect our family. And now," she glanced meaningfully at Julia, "it's time to let someone protect you." The hours that followed were filled with explanations, tears, and surprisingly laughter. Elizabeth revealed all the documents she had kept, showing how Daniel had quietly corrected the mistakes of the past over the years. The Lancaster fortune had been rebuilt legitimately, the old frauds carefully dismantled, without causing a market collapse. "And Richard?" Julia asked. "Does he know?" "He always knew where I was," Elizabeth confirmed. "But he understood his role was to stay away, allowing Daniel to clean up the family name. His recent hospitalization was his way of passing the baton for good." "And now?" Daniel asked, his hand firmly intertwined with Julia's. "How will we explain all of this?" Elizabeth smiled, that smile Julia knew so well from photographs. The truth, or at least part of it. A story of redemption and family reunion. The public loves these narratives, and the press will be kinder if we control the story. And Jonathan? It's time for him to know the whole truth, Elizabeth declared. About Robert, about the past, about everything. He's stronger now, especially with all the support he's been receiving. She looked meaningfully at Julia. The sun was already high when they left the House of Roses. Elizabeth would return with them, ready to face the consequences of her return. In the car, Julia watched through the rearview mirror as Daniel held his mother's hand, as if afraid she might disappear again. In the weeks that followed, the Lancaster story dominated the headlines. Elizabeth's miraculous return, the revelation about Jonathan's paternity, presented as a recent discovery, the transformation of the companies under Daniel's leadership. Vivian, surprisingly, was instrumental in managing the public narrative, channeling her manipulative skills into something positive for the first time. Jonathan, with the support of both parents, Robert and Richard, began to show consistent signs of recovery. The truth, instead of destroying him as everyone feared, seemed to set him free. Elizabeth was right. Some truths, no matter how painful, are essential for healing. As for Daniel and Julia, their wedding took place the following spring, no longer a business arrangement but a celebration of true love. The garden of the Lancaster mansion, filled with roses in honor of the place where all truths had come to light, witnessed their vows. In her speech during the reception, Elizabeth shared a wisdom that perfectly summarized her journey. True love is not just about finding the right person, but about being brave enough to let that person find us, with all our truths, all our scars, all our past. And so the Lancaster family found their redemption not through power or money, but through love, truth, and the courage to face the ghosts of the past. The mansion, once a mausoleum of secrets, became a true home where laughter echoed through the halls and where every rose in the garden told a story of forgiveness and new beginnings. And Julia? She continued her work at the hospital, now not only as head nurse but also as part of the board of directors for the new psychiatric treatment wing, established through a partnership between the Lancasters and Dr. Matthews. Her gift of seeing beyond appearances, of believing in goodness even in the darkest moments, had not only transformed her own life, but touched and healed an entire family. Because in the end, the Lancasters' greatest secret was not hidden in documents or vaults, but in the transformative power of true love, the kind that doesn't back down in the face of obstacles, that isn't intimidated by secrets, and that has the courage to believe that even in the darkest nights, dawn always comes, bringing with it the promise of a new beginning. Dear readers, we hope Julia and the Lancasters' journey has touched your hearts as much as it has touched ours. A story that reminds us that true love has the power to heal old wounds and bring to light the most deeply guarded truths. To continue exploring equally thrilling and transformative stories, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Here, every story is carefully chosen to inspire, move, and make us believe in the power of love and redemption. Share in the comments which part of the story you enjoyed the most and which city you're following us from. Together, we'll continue discovering that the best stories are the ones that make us believe in the magic of new beginnings. Until the next story!